Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'd like to welcome you back to another WSR live streaming session. And today we are going to continue with our discussions on a variety of topics as we move through the next phase of the environmental assessment process, after the TOR approval, that is. Every other week on Wednesdays at this same time, we will discuss a new topic and want to encourage you to provide as much input as possible by calling or texting us with your questions or comments. The number is 1-844-424-0500. We are doing these radio shows and streaming sessions to help community members and the general public get a better understanding of what's involved in the federal impact assessment and provincial environmental assessment processes, and to encourage viewers and listeners to participate in these two activities. With me today is Marian Tibor McMahon, who is the Deputy Project Manager for ICE on the Webequie Supply Road project. Good afternoon, Marian. Welcome back again for another chat.
Good afternoon. Yes, happy to be here as always.
Lots to talk about and not enough time.
Exactly.
Okay, so for the benefit of everyone, today's session is called Indigenous Knowledge Part 2, Weaving IK into EAs and IAs. And in this session, we're going to talk about how IK can be used in environmental or impact assessments by using real examples from a number of different disciplines or areas of study. Hopefully, this will encourage Indigenous community members to share their IK and further inform the WSR environmental and impact assessments. So, Marian, let's get started. Maybe you can do a quick run through of what we're going to cover today, which is slide number 2 for our tech team.
Sure. So we'll begin with talking about briefly where we are right now. Then we will go into a little part 1 review of what was discussed last session. And then we will dive into how IK contributes to EAs and IAs and use some examples there. And then we will go into a little discussion about the integration of IK with scientific data. And then we'll talk about the Webequie Supply Road IK program and then what's coming up next in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Marian. Let's move to slide number 3 now. And what we're going to talk about now very briefly is just where we are in the overall planning process. So last October 8th, our terms of reference, or the work plan for the provincial environmental assessment, was approved by MECP. And so we then moved into what we call the EA phase, the environmental assessment phase of the work. So that's where we stand now on the project. So if we can move to slide number 4 now. Marian, before we dive in too deeply, I think it's important for us to do a review of what we talked a little review of what we talked about last week to get some of our listeners and viewers up to speed. Why don't you talk a bit about what IK is, because it can be kind of hard to define, can't it?
For sure. And there's no single definition of Indigenous knowledge. It's really, the understandings, the skills, philosophies developed by Indigenous peoples and communities who have long histories of interactions with their environment and their surroundings. So essentially, it's the worldview of Indigenous peoples. And it's also a holistic understanding, as it consists of many parts that are really interconnected with the environment and communities. And Indigenous knowledge, it's cumulative and it's ever evolving because it changes as Indigenous peoples experience and adapt to different social, economic, environmental, spiritual, and political changes.
If we can move to slide number 5 now, please, tech team. That's it. Okay. To add to the mystery of Indigenous knowledge, what I like to call the mystery of Indigenous knowledge, it can take many, many different forms. So a lot of people are familiar with Indigenous knowledge being collected via the use of maps, which was, has been a very popular method of collecting IK for a long time, where community members would identify things like burial sites or harvesting locations or spiritual sites or ceremonial areas, uh, hunting camps, like family hunting camps, trapping areas, travel routes, things like that. But it's more than that. The information can come from a number of different sources, such as community surveys, focus groups, um, descriptions of, and the kind of information gleaned from those different methods would be things like the descriptions of traditions, descriptions of how communities are governed, how they're organized, how community members make decisions as a group. And then quite often now, Indigenous knowledge takes the form of stories and oral histories, which can be very, very instructive. Um, Marian, IK is very important for to the environmental or impact assessment processes. Maybe you can talk a little bit about this for us.
Sure. So IK is very valuable when we do an impact assessment and environmental assessment because it gets combined with Western science throughout the processes. And really, IK provides the evidence and the understanding of the natural, social, economic, and cultural environments, including, as you were saying, Indigenous governance, traditional laws, customs, and even uses of the land and resources in the area. So, Indigenous knowledge is used to inform our baseline studies. It's used to help identify potential environmental effects of a project. So, it's a really key component to the EA and the IA to understand even the values of Indigenous communities and how best to assess potential impacts and propose appropriate mitigation measures on those impacts.
Thanks, Marion. So now that we've done the review, let's dig into how IK contributes to EAs and IAs. I thought the best way to do this would be to include the kinds of questions that we as technical people might ask of community members. And then from each question, we can discuss how the answers, in other words, the Indigenous knowledge provided, could feed into the environmental assessment or the impact assessment. So let's move to slide number 7 now and start with a familiar example, which would be fish and fish habitat. So looking at fish and fish habitat, the kinds of questions that a technical person might ask of community members might be, which species of fish do you eat? And that information is important because it identifies the key species to to target in the fisheries surveys, or it can help direct the human health surveys. And talking about the human health surveys, if we were to ask a question of community members such as, do you consume all parts of the fish or use the non-consumed parts of for other purposes, that might guide the human health survey in telling us to collect tissue from other parts of the fish, such as maybe organs, because maybe community members uh, use those and consume those other parts of the fish. Um, some other questions might be, do you have specific areas where you fish, and have these locations changed over time? This helps us sort of identify areas of significance and can contribute to identifying route alternatives and the positioning of the road. Another question which we could ask, and we did ask for WSR, was where are the spawning areas for the species that you eat? And knowing that information helps us with design of the surveys themselves, helps in development of alternatives for the road, and it helps in identifying the locations to cross specific water courses as well. Um, Another question that could be asked would be, what times of year do you fish for each species? And this would help in timing of the actual fisheries surveys. And if the project proceeds to the construction phase, um, it could guide the timing of different construction activities as well too. So let's move on, Marian, to another study area of an environmental or impact assessment where IK is extremely valuable, and that's wildlife surveys. So if our tech team can move to slide number 8, please, and then Marian will explain from there.
Sure. So, one of the questions that we ask community members in terms of wildlife is, where do you typically find different wildlife species? So this allows us to reconcile the knowledge from experience and observations that community members have with scientific knowledge. And we combine that with our knowledge about the habitat from other studies, from conducting field surveys, and even through training. Another question that we ask community members is, where are the preferred hunting areas for different species? And this allows us to design our baseline studies and our field surveys appropriately. We even ask, when do you hunt different species? And that also allows us to schedule baseline studies to avoid any potential impacts on traditional activities and in those areas. And that will also, moving forward, will help us schedule the timing of construction activities. And lastly, we ask, where are the nursery areas for large mammals, such as caribou and moose? And again, there we'll be able to understand the community members' experience and observations related to caribou and moose. And we pair that with our knowledge through our surveys, about the habitat and the area.
Thanks, Marian. Let's move now to a couple of different areas that aren't necessarily as well known as part of an environmental assessment or an impact assessment. And those two areas are visual impact analysis and noise. So let's look at visual impact analysis first. Um, Couple of the questions you might ask as part of this, and this is, oh, we have the slide up, is how do you access where you hunt and fish? And what routes do you take to get there? So knowing that kind of information, um, we can assess whether there might be impacts to what we call something. It's something that's not really something you can touch. It's intangible. It's the experience of being on the land and water, preserving that experience, not disturbing that experience, um, and preserving that ability for community members to transfer that cultural knowledge without disturbances. So it's kind of a hard thing to really describe in detail, but like another component of it is family and community cohesion or togetherness and impacts that the project might have on places where families retreat to and have retreated to for generations for their own family experiences. So these are things that we may not always think of, but they're very, very important. Another question might be, are there special areas of your homeland, such as spiritual sites, where views of the landscape are especially important? So trying to see if there are visual impacts on the landscape from the project, because sometimes those vistas, those view sheds, if you want to call them, from these important locations, whether it's a spiritual site or some other kind of cultural site, they're what help. They help what they are what help make that area special, right? So, what you need to understand where these areas are, so you can either eliminate or mitigate or reduce those kind of visual impacts. So that's the visual impact side of things. Now, the noise impact side of things is interesting too. The kind of question you might want to ask is, are there specific areas where noise from the road could affect your enjoyment of traditional activities such as hunting, fishing, or spiritual experiences. Um, so you can imagine, I mean, if there are special areas where, for example, families might use on a regular basis or even on an occasional basis, and they're impacted by the project in terms of much higher noise levels, that affects that experience, and and it can cause some, maybe some erosion of the culture because maybe that experience couldn't be continued. But these are the kinds of things that have to be considered. Um, Another area of the application of IK data or Indigenous knowledge data is in siting or routing facilities. If we can move to slide number 11, please. This is a very common application of the use of IK. Um, this is probably pretty familiar to a lot of community members, and the kinds of questions that might be asked by a technical team might be, where should the road go so that it doesn't interfere with traditional activities such as hunting or fishing? And of course, that information is extremely helpful because um, it helps in the constraint analysis, like looking at all the places where the road can't go and trying to thread that road through the landscape so that they're minimizing disturbance by by looking at all the constraints and figuring out where the best place to put the road might be. It also contributes to baseline studies, tracking caribou through the study area, and then the answers to that question could help in identifying potential wildlife crossing locations because maybe the wildlife typically migrates through a specific area where the road might be, and if maybe the road can be moved, or maybe there's a way of mitigating impacts by building some sort of wildlife crossing as well. And another kind of question that might be asked could be, are there important spiritual sites that need to be avoided? This can help with baseline study design so that when the baseline studies are done, they don't impact these areas in any way. Constraint analysis, again, helping with route alternatives, development of route alternatives, and then socioeconomics, preserving the cultural and language by avoiding any impact on these areas. So, Marian, our next example is another EAIA sort of study area where Indigenous knowledge is critical, and that's climate change.
For sure. So, one of the questions that we ask community members related to climate change is, has the behavior of different wildlife species changed over time? And has this caused you to make adjustments to what, where, how, and when you hunt fish? So, the IK that we get from community members, they allow us to develop mitigation measures to avoid specific habitat and hunting areas there. Another question we ask community members is, has there been a noticeable change in water level fluctuations over time? Has this caused you to make adjustments to what, where, how, and when you hunt and fish? So again, there, information that we gather from community members will allow us to develop mitigation measures to avoid specific habitats and hunting and fishing areas that are important to community members. It also helps us with the road design because then we'll be able to design at a higher design elevation and use more tools to kind of equalize the flows, such as culverts. And then it also helps us with our water crossing designs, and we design to withstand higher water levels and flows, and it allows us to have a longer planning window as well. And we also ask community members to tell us about the changes in the winter road season that they're experiencing. Has it become shorter? Have there been more accidents related to crossing over ice than previously? And there, it allows us to understand, really the benefits of an all season road versus a winter road. And, we want to make sure that the road that we're building is sustainable for the community. And we are hearing from community members that the winter road season is getting shorter by the year. So we want to
It
make
it
sure
sure
that.
it sure is, Marian. And climate change, you and I both know it's a big issue in northern
Mhm.
communities, and it's not just. I mean, on the preliminary engineering side, there's a lot of effort made to look at longer planning windows and anticipating large, more impactful events, I guess, in the design and building that in. But I think that information is important. But sitting down with community members and talking to them about things that they may have seen over time, and how things may have changed, it's very, very helpful in understanding climate change and how it's sort of manifesting itself, how it's displaying itself in a particular area. So climate change is huge. Let's now move to our final example, and that example is vegetation, which is kind of interesting because uh, when Western scientists look at an environmental assessment or an impact assessment like this, they they may say, okay, well, our field work is going to be focused on looking for species at risk, and um, but community members, when you talk to them, they have there are a number of important plant species. Whether they're for consumption, as a type of food or as medicine. So the species that they identify may not be quite the same as what the Western scientists might be interested in, what the technical people might be interested in. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, we've had, as you know, Marion, we've sat down with community members and had that discussion about important plant species to community members, and they weren't species at risk, the ones that were provided to us, but we do want to make sure that we do not, in identifying the proper route for the road, that we don't, impact areas where important plant species to community members exist. So that's really important. So, it helps us, knowing that information helps us in route alternative development in avoiding certain areas. It also helps in human health survey design by providing guidance in selection of different species, by identifying the species that community members consume most commonly. And so we've done that for WSR, and we've identified specific species and gathered samples of each for lab testing as well, to understand that, to truly understand that baseline. So um, if we can move now to slide number 14, this is sort of, these slides are always kind of tricky to explain, but slide 14 is, it shows, it's showing the Western science approach, methods of collecting data, and then Indigenous knowledge data collection methods such as interviews or workshops or mapping or review of documents, surveys, oral collection of oral histories, just observations, general observations. And then, of course, you have the more traditional, on the scientific data collection side, things like mapping and sampling and tissue sampling and more scientific methods. So, the art is in taking the data that's collected from both sides, and as as the word we like to use is weaving it together and figuring out how to combine that together to deliver a comprehensive environmental assessment that is going to answer the questions to the greatest degree possible as to, how much this project, what impacts this project may have. So there's a lot to it, and this is an area that is changing rapidly. There's no recipe or specific stepped procedure to combining indigenous knowledge with Western science, but it's advancing pretty quickly, and there's some really interesting work that's being done right now. So, Marian, we officially kicked off the WSR Indigenous Knowledge Program a few months ago. Can you tell us, maybe our listeners, a bit about the program, because I think it's important for communities to know what it's about and what we're looking for.
Sure. So we kicked off the program in December. We sent out invitation letters to Indigenous communities, inviting them to participate in the IK program, and we continue to follow up with communities. And essentially, our IK program, it's going to be a collaborative program where we work closely with the interested community and their community members to ensure that community values and learnings inform the impact and the environmental assessment. It'll inform the baseline studies. It's going to inform our how we identify potential impacts and develop mitigation measures for that. And we will invite communities to share, as much Indigenous knowledge information as they wish, and in their preferred format, whether that be through, a mapping workshop, through interviews, focus groups, or if they want us to review any of their previous reports. So we will invite them to do it that way. We will also honor and respect the confidentiality principles, because, we understand that Indigenous knowledge, it's valuable information, it belongs to the communities. So we will work with the community in developing an Indigenous knowledge sharing agreement prior to the collection and the use of the community's information. Now, a key component to the IK program is we're not just going to take the information collected and put it into the environmental assessment. A key component to that is the validation of the Indigenous knowledge to ensure that we have a good understanding of that IK and that we're capturing it appropriately in the EA and the IA. And we'll be able to review that with the community, so that way we can seek their input and make changes to that as they see fit. So again, just wanted to remind everyone that we have that invite letter out to communities, and we hope to be hearing from communities soon, so that way we can get the IK information and start working with the communities.
Thank you, Marian. And before we close out, I wanted to talk briefly about what's coming up next. So in 2 weeks, which is actually Wednesday, March 23rd, we are going to finish our series on Indigenous knowledge. So we'll be doing part 3 on IK, and we're working on a few ideas for that show. And so hopefully we might be able to have a special guest for that, I think, Marian. Let's hope so. And that'll make things really, really interesting. I think that's about it. We had a lot to cover today. I think we got through it okay. I hope it was clear for our viewers. And so that wraps up today's discussion. And I'd like you to join us again in 2 weeks when we complete our 3-part series on IK. Don't forget to visit our website at supplyroad.ca, or visit us on social media at WFN Supply Road. Marian, thanks for joining me. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. And
yes, thank you.
Thanks to everyone for watching. We'll see you soon. Miigwech, and have a good evening.